What is going on, guys? We are almost there. Rlcs X is here. The first weekend is coming up, and we're doing some Swiss. And the biggest question is, how are we going to determine Swiss? Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit of my philosophies of why I went with this system compared to some others. But we'll get into that as we go. One thing to note, this is for Regional 1. I want to emphasize that we are adaptable, and if after Regional 1 we want to mix up the seeds a little bit, do it a little bit differently, that is a possibility going into Regional 2. But we'll talk about that when we get to that point. I'm going to take away my face cam probably during different parts of this, just so you guys can see everything I put in my fancy PowerPoint. But let's get into it. So first off, the Swiss structure. I'll take away my cam here for a second so you guys can see what it looks like on the right side of your screen, where it's basically the Swiss structure is there is a total of 16 teams in your group. They play throughout. They always play someone with the same record. So at the beginning of the round, you get your first round matchup. Don't worry about the seeds here too much in this graphic on the top right there. But generally, you just play pretty much anyone, and we'll talk about how we actually do our matchups. But you play anyone, then all the 1-0s, they play each other. All the 0-1s, they all play each other. Then the 2-0s play each other, 1-1s and 0-2s, until you hit either 3 wins or 3 losses. If you make it to 3 wins, you have qualified. You are done for the day. You will move on to weekend number 2. If you get 3 losses, you are out, and that is your final placement in this whole thing. So it's going to be 2 groups of 16 teams on weekend 1. We'll do Group A on day 1 on Saturday, Group B on day 2. We'll play through the entire Swiss stage for these guys, and your final placement will be determined by that for when you're getting eliminated. Now, obviously, if you go 3-0, that's going to help you going into the following weekend. You'll have a better seed going into that Swiss, which is another Swiss of 16 teams, the top 8 from each. We'll move on to that until we get into a playoff where it's just 8 teams. But we're not really focusing on that here because we've talked about that in the past. But say you go 0-3, you finish tied for 29th because there's 4 teams that will tie for that spot because there's 2 groups in this Swiss. So you'll tie for 29th. If you go a little bit higher, bad with math, tied for 17th or whatever. So on and so forth. Or not 17th, but there's only 3 teams. But you get my point. Tied for 23rd. So 3 teams and 3 teams from each group. So again, 3 wins or 3 losses. That's really all you have to worry about. Now I know everyone wants to know exactly how we are going to do our Swiss style. And there's a lot of different ways of going about it. We'll save that for later. I hit the wrong button. So I was looking through Swiss styles and trying to figure out exactly how I wanted to do it, and I couldn't really find a system that I really enjoyed. So some people do it based on the Elo system. That's what Counter-Strike now does after they used to do it full RNG. First, we'll talk about the Elo system. What they do, I think, at least relatively recently, is they have everyone in their group rank every team. And when you get those rankings, that is your Elo to begin. So if someone gets ranked nearly first every single time, they're ranked like 1.2. But one of the things I found that the problem with Elo is sometimes those teams get such heavy emphasis when you are a good team that you can't really move around all that much. There was one example, I think Team Fnatic lost to the 2 worst teams in the entire Swiss, the 15th and 16th seed, and they were ranked number 1. They went into the 0-2 round around like an 8 Elo, while a team that was sitting around the 8th or 9th seed, they went 1-1, lost to a good team, beat, a bad team. They were ranked lower than them while they were 1-1. So it just really emphasized, all right, when you get your seed going in, it's very difficult to move. It might matter when it comes down to that final round of the 2-2s. But in general, if you're playing a team with the same record and you're going to base it on Elo, these teams are not going to move a lot. So if you are the number 1 team and you're 1-2 and you play a team that's number 5 and they go 1-2, well, you're not going to move around a lot. So I didn't really want to go with that because it kind of rewards of we don't know exactly where to seed these guys right now. There's been some community tournaments going on, obviously, and we can get the general gist, but it kind of gets muddied after, maybe a top 5. In both North America plus Europe. So I didn't really want to go with an Elo system. There's other systems where very closely to Elo based on, wins and losses and all of that. I couldn't really put math behind it just yet. And I think maybe at some point we will, but that's not the case right now. So I didn't want to do that. The other way would have been, all right, if a 16 seed beats a 1 seed in that first round, do they just inherit the 1 seed? At that point, you're just doing triple limb bracket, and Swiss is just a cover-up for a triple limb bracket. Because normally, like in a bracket like that, in any other format, if a 16 beats a 1, they just inherit the 1 seed. They play either the 8th or 9th seed next. And that's too drastic, obviously, going the opposite way. So on both sides, with Elo, it's maybe too heavily emphasized with the number 1 teams, or like the highly rated teams, and the lower teams don't really get a chance to move up. And in the opposite way of like, let's just do a triple limb bracket, obviously that then the lower teams, if they get an upset and they're automatically the number 1 seed, then that is too skewed. So I kind of wanted to do a mixture. The other system is just full RNG. And some games have tried this before where it's like, all right, we're literally just going to randomize every single game. That I don't like, because I don't want, an energy playing a space station or something in round 1. You generally don't want that, because if you do have, like, say, the top 4 teams, or the ones you think are the top 4 seeds, if they all get matched up versus one another in round 1, then 2 of them have to lose, and they could be matched up again against each other in round 2. And then if they're going into round 3, 0-2, a top 4 team could be 0-2 at that point. And again, in Rocket League, it could be very difficult to come out of that hole. Obviously, there's some, not necessarily randomization, but obviously there's upset potential in Rocket League, very similar to hockey, in my opinion, where there is more upset potential than maybe a basketball. And for you European fans out there, you won't know what I'm talking about at all. So I didn't want to go with that system. So with all that being said, here's what I came up with for the very first round. And again, this is for Regional 1. This could change after this Regional, where teams will now have points and all that stuff, but we'll see as we go. But basically, I went with... Oh, I didn't realize that this was a hidden text. So let's first go to how groups are selected. I forgot about this step, but let's talk about it really quick. The groups are selected, basically, teams are seeded 1 through 32 by a committee. The Season 9 teams from RLCS, they get the top 10 seeds, so they get that little bonus for being in the RLCS. So even if a team played poorly throughout the community tournaments, they will still be a top 10 seed going into this tournament. Qualified teams will be based on their qualifiers. That's how they'll be seeded. So like if they finish in the upper bracket, they'll have a higher seed than if they finish in the lower bracket. This mostly matters for North America. In Europe, they're actually playing out the entire qualifiers, because the grid needs 1 additional spot because 1 team disbanded. So we'll basically know what your seed is out of the qualifiers based on how you perform. There'll be some ties, and that could be where the history comes in, where it's like, all right, I think this team's better than this team. We'll rank them ahead. Teams are evenly split like into 2 groups of 16, and that doesn't mean like we go back and forth like 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 in one group, 2, through that. It's more based on this. Now, some of these could change very, very slightly. I believe it was this one. Yes. So basically, your Group A, you have your RLCS teams, 1, 4, 5, 8, and 10. Then your upper bracket teams, 2, 3, 6, and 7. Those seeds based on, the top 8 of the upper bracket, lower bracket, and then the last chance qualifier for those last few spots. And that's how we would determine how we get our groups. Now you can see here, they're split into 4 groups. Now we're going to get to that. So that is what is coming up next. So this is how it'll look like to make it relatively even between Group A and Group B. So let's move forward and let's talk about how do matchups get chosen. Now this is what everyone wants to know, right? I kind of wanted to do a seeded system with some RNG elements, because I think the biggest positive to Swiss is we get to see so many varied matchups to really see where these teams land. And that's why I wanted to open up the entire RLCS X split, or the entire season, with Swiss, is because we will get so much data from this that we will be hard locked into like, all right, this team definitely is number 1, or this team is definitely 5th compared to this team at 10th, because in Swiss, they're playing so many games. They're extremely varied matchups, and you have so many lives, right? You have 3 wins or 3 losses to move on. So you're going to be playing a ton. So what I did was you pool the teams in round 1 into 4 pools of 4 teams. So again, as we saw with that thing where we had the RLCS teams as 1, 4, 5, 8 would be the top 4 in Group A. Let me get rid of my camera here real quick so you can read the rest. It's not much there at the bottom, but the only extra layer that I added to this was seed number 1 cannot play seed number 13. So the top 4 seeds will play the bottom 4 seeds. It'll be a randomly drawn matchup between those guys. And I think honestly, like a lot of these matchups are going to be like, how do you rank a team 28th or 32nd? It's going to be very, very small dividends. So that's why it's like, all right, now we get a little RNG in there. We get random matchups so these teams can try and prove their worth. And maybe they get a little bit of a lighter matchup. Maybe they don't. But like, I don't want a team getting hard locked into a seed early on. And it's like, all right, we're 32nd seed. We go into the next Swiss tournament. Oh, we got to play G2 again, round 1. And when we lose that, well, guess what? We got to play the 15th or 16th seed or whatever in round 2, and we're going to start 0-2. And it's not necessarily fair, but it's like, it's hard to get out of a hard lock seed at times, unless, you know, different teams, they qualify and all of that. But I just didn't want teams getting like hard locked in that way, and I wanted to give them a little bit of a breath of fresh air and give them a chance. Now, at the end of the day, if you lose 3 times in Swiss, you deserve to be out. Like at that point, like worst case, you're playing top 6, maybe, like 1 through 6 seeds throughout all 3 of your matchups. And that is very, very, very rare. Because obviously if you go 0-1 and 0-2, like you should get wins there, obviously, to come back up. But you could play like number 6 in that final round. But honestly, if you're not top 6 and there's only 8 teams qualifying and we're not really sure if you should have been, you know, it's like, at some point, do better next time, right? So, seeds 1 through 4 will get randomly drawn against seeds 13 through 16. Seed number 1 cannot play seed number 13, and the reason that is, and this is more for the NA side, I keep hitting the wrong buttons here, is basically I didn't want the RLCS number 1 playing the last lower bracket team. I didn't want to give the lower bracket team kind of that like, oh crap, we have to play the best team in the RLCS, and I think they deserved a little bit better. So just to avoid that matchup. It's the same for seed number 5, cannot play seed number 9. And that's, again, I didn't want an RLCS team having to play against an upper bracket team from the qualifiers. This, again, mostly pertains to North America, but we're keeping the rule in anyway for Europe, just because I think it will mitigate a little bit more of that randomness in round number 1. And then after round number 1 is over, then you got your 8 teams at 1-0, your 8 teams at 0-1. Every single round after that will be seeded by committee, and generally I think seeds are going to stay relatively the same unless upsets happen, and that's where you can start seeing seeds go into like different places. But I didn't want to like hard lock a team into a seed in terms of like an Elo, because let's say for me, I have BDS and Oxygen. 2 teams I think that are incredibly close, depending on how you want to seed them. I think I have BDS number 2 barely, just because they won a tournament throughout the Euro Cup, throughout the community tournaments. And then Oxygen I had at number 3. But honestly, I'm splitting hairs, right? Like I could put either one of those at 2 and 3. So round 1 could honestly determine where I put them in round 2, where if BDS wins 3-2 against a very bad team, Oxygen wins 3-0, I might bump Oxygen up just a little bit, just slightly above BDS. Now, at the end of the day, that's not going to matter too much, because when we get to round 2, round 3, round 4, round 5, we're still going to pull the teams into, we basically split them in half. So in round 2, there's 8 teams in the top and 8 teams in the bottom. So you split it top 4, bottom 4. For the 1-0 teams, top 4, bottom 4 for the 0-1 teams. So the only time it really will matter is when you're trying to split hairs or trying to figure out where you're going to seed, is when you're right on that cusp, the 4 or 5 range of like, do you put them in the top half? Do you put them in the lower half? And I think that is one downside to this, is like, if teams are that close, the randomization could really hurt one of those teams, where if they just barely got edged out and get the number 5 seed, they could play the number 1 RLCS team, or and the other guy could play the 8th best team, which is a team from the upper bracket from the qualifiers. At the end of the day, I think the seeds are not going to matter as much. And say that does happen and you lose a round, one, your seeding's really not going to get like all that hurt from losing to a number 1 seed. So when you go to that 1-1 round, you're going to be one of those top half teams, and you're going to play one of those bottom half teams. And at the end of the day, again, Swiss, 3 wins or 3 losses. There's a lot of extra leniency on your play, and also I think leniency on the seeds. And I think this is why I wanted to randomize it a little bit, just to get varied matchups. And I don't want, again, people to get hard locked into a seed, and then it's very hard to move out of that seed. So I just wanted varied matchups, pretty much. So the only other rule is no rematches are allowed on the same Swiss day. That's a very common one where you, like, the only time it happens is like round 4 and round 5, but you just can't play the same team. So say if at the end you have 3 teams at 2-2 in the top half, 3 teams 2-2 in the bottom half. If 2 of those teams from the top play 2 of those teams in the bottom, then we already know our matchups, right? You line everyone else up and you're good to go, basically. Or you just randomize so he can't play that rematch. Like, I guess it would have to be all 3 for it to be, we know what the games are. But that's the only other thing. There's just no rematches allowed on the same Swiss day. So that's my thoughts behind why we did it for Regional 1. Like, I think a lot of it has to do with, like, seeds are kind of, like, up in the air a lot of times with these community tournaments where, you know, sometimes it's one bad game throws you down and all that stuff, and it's, like, hard to actually seed where these guys are. Plus, you know, they were community tournaments, right? Teams are changing rosters. Teams are not ramping up into RLCS just yet. And I don't want to punish teams that are like, hey, we're feeling it out because we're trying to figure out our team for RLCS and they get bad results, but they're working at it well as a team, and they might have a lower seed at the beginning of this, but randomization could get them a 4th seed matchup, or if they do well in qualifiers, obviously, that they can move up. But if they get a pretty close series even versus like the top seed of like an NRG, then they can move up and be a better seed later on. And again, like, I think for Swiss, there's really no excuse if you do lose. Like, sure, you might get a slightly bad draw, but at the end of the day, the worst draw that you're going to get is you weren't a top 6 team and only 8 qualify. And at that point, you weren't going to make it to the weekend anyway, right? Or to the playoff bracket. So we'll see how it goes. There's obviously 3 of these, so we'll see if we continue with the seeding process. But at the end of the day, again, 3 Swiss tournaments leading into a major, hopefully, will be great to just see where all these teams kind of land. The playoff bracket's going to be a lot of fun. 8 teams go into that for the final Sunday, and that's going to be a lot of fun. But like, I'm more interested in all these varied matchups. How do teams perform? How do they accumulate their points throughout? And then we'll be looking pretty good going into Split 2. Like, I think we will know very well of, like, all right, these points have lined these teams up very, very, very well going into Split 2 and Split 3 with different formats coming up. So keep that in mind. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys enjoy it. If you don't, or if you think of a better like matchup-based thing for Swiss, let me know. Throw it in the comments. I'm always looking for new ideas. Like, I've looked through a bunch, and I just haven't found anyone I completely love. But this one I think is going to be a lot of fun. So definitely check it out. And root for your teams. It's going to be a lot of fun for this weekend. We got Europe coming up. I thought it was NA, and I completely forgot. And, you know, I have 2 kids at home during quarantine, and I'm watching them all day. So it's been rough. It's been rough. So when I get to work on the weekends, it's actually my off time from the kids. So that'll be nice. But looking forward to being on the desk once again. I guess that's confirmation that I'll be there. If you want to put that in Wikipedia, feel free. But that'll do it for me. I'll see you guys this weekend for RLCS X. That's it. Bye-bye.